On April 14, 2026, in Ottawa, Prime Minister Mark Carney and Finland's President Alexander Stubb turned a hockey photo opportunity into something far less casual, a public show of alignment as Canada and Finland quietly moved to build an Arctic firewall against U.S. pressure. The smiles were polished, the skates were optional, and the message was not. The setting mattered. Ottawa has been trying to project calm, but the timing of the visit points to a sharper strategy taking shape behind the scenes. Finland, now a NATO member with deep Arctic expertise, and Canada, which controls vast northern territory and critical shipping routes, are increasingly treating the High North as a shared security file rather than a scenic backdrop. That shift is not happening in a vacuum. Washington has been pushing allies harder on trade, defense spending, and supply chain dependence, and both Ottawa and Helsinki know exactly what that means in practice: less room to maneuver, more pressure to fall in line. In that context, a hockey stick and a handshake can look a lot like diplomacy for the cameras, while the real work happens elsewhere. The Arctic angle is where the story gets serious. Canada and Finland have been expanding coordination on infrastructure, surveillance, and resilience in northern regions, with officials framing the effort as cooperation and critics reading it as insurance against a more unpredictable United States. As one Canadian official familiar with the talks put it, the point is to reduce vulnerability, not advertise it. Finland brings technical credibility to the table. It has decades of experience in cold weather logistics, ice-capable vessels, and civil defense planning, all of which have become more valuable as Arctic sea lanes, mineral access, and military positioning move up the global agenda. Canada, meanwhile, has the geography, the legal claims, and the political need to show it can defend the North without leaning entirely on Washington. That is why the optics in Ottawa landed so neatly. Stubb and Carney were not just posing for the usual diplomatic album, they were signaling that Canada has options and that Finland is one of them. The choreography may have looked light, but the underlying message was heavy. The North is becoming a strategic zone, and the old assumption that the United States sets the terms is no longer being taken as gospel. For now, the public line remains friendly, practical, and deliberately bland. But in the background, both governments are working through a harder question about how far to go in building a northern security architecture that can stand on its own when Washington turns the screws. The smiles hide a far larger negotiation. The real pressure point is no longer just the Arctic. It is the way Washington has turned tariffs, trade threats, and territorial rhetoric into a blunt instrument that is forcing Canada and its Nordic partners to reassess how exposed they are to the United States. Trump's return to tariff-first politics has revived a familiar problem for allies. Access can be used as leverage, and leverage can be used as coercion. Ottawa has watched that playbook before. From steel and aluminum disputes to broader threats against supply chains, and the message this time is even clearer. Dependence is a liability, not a guarantee of protection. Greenland has become part of that same conversation. Repeated U.S. interest in the island, paired with talk that treated sovereignty like a bargaining chip, rattled officials in Copenhagen and Nuuk and raised the stakes across the North Atlantic. For Nordic governments, the issue was not just about one territory. It was about whether Washington still sees allied borders as fixed or negotiable when politics gets messy. That has pushed Canada, Finland, Denmark, and other partners to think less like spectators and more like contingency planners. Security officials and trade advisors are now looking at the same map and asking the same blunt question. What happens if the United States is no longer the stabilizer, but the immediate source of disruption? The answer is showing up in policy. Ottawa has been widening discussions on critical minerals, port access, Arctic surveillance, and transport resilience, while Nordic capitals are doing the same on energy, civil defense, and dual-use infrastructure. These are not flashy moves, but they are the kind of boring, expensive steps governments take when they stop assuming the old order will hold. Supply chains are getting the same treatment. Canada's export dependence on the U.S. market has long been treated as a strength because it came with scale and predictability. But tariff threats have exposed how quickly that can flip. Businesses in agriculture, manufacturing, and shipping are now being pushed to diversify routes, buyers, and financing because the price of being overcommitted to one market is suddenly obvious. The political effect is just as important as the economic one. When Washington talks about tariffs one day, Greenland the next, and defense burden sharing the day after, allies do not hear a coherent strategy. They hear volatility, and volatility is what drives countries to hedge. That is why the current realignment is not only about Canada and Finland standing closer together, it is also about a wider Atlantic Circle quietly deciding that security planning can no longer be built on trust alone, especially when the most powerful player keeps changing the terms mid-game. Ottawa's crisis began long before this photo op. The November 2024 Icebreaker Collaboration Pact, or ICE Pact, was sold as a practical Arctic cooperation deal among the United States, Canada, and Finland. But by early 2026, it had started to look like something else. An industrial template for working around Washington instead of through it. What began as a joint effort on polar security, shipbuilding, and technology sharing is now helping Canada and its Nordic partners build the kind of capacity that makes strategic dependence on the US look optional, not inevitable. The pact's most consequential feature is not diplomatic symbolism, but industrial design. It ties together icebreaker planning, shipyard coordination, and dual-use technology in a way that gives Ottawa, Helsinki, and their partners a shared production logic, one that can survive political turbulence in Washington, that matters because icebreakers are not just ships, they are infrastructure, procurement pipelines, and long-term manufacturing commitments wrapped into one expensive asset. For Canada, the value is obvious. The country has spent years talking about Arctic sovereignty while relying on aging fleets, stretched maintenance schedules, and foreign suppliers for critical maritime capability. IcePact gives Canadian officials a framework to expand domestic shipbuilding, deepen ties with Finnish technical expertise, and reduce the risk that any future U.S. policy shift can freeze out projects midstream. Finland brings the part everyone wants, but few can quickly build. Icebreaker know-how. Finnish shipyards and marine engineers have spent decades refining Arctic hull design, propulsion systems, and cold weather operations, which makes them central to any serious northern build-out. Under IcePact, that expertise is no longer just a bilateral asset. It becomes part of a wider allied production network that can be scaled without waiting for Washington to set the pace. The shipyard angle is where the story gets sharper. By linking procurement and industrial planning across borders, the pact encourages participating countries to think in terms of shared capacity rather than single-country dependence. That means more standardized designs, more interoperable parts, and more leverage for governments that want to buy from one another instead of defaulting to US-controlled supply chains. There is also a quiet technology transfer story here, and it is not trivial. Icebreaker construction pulls in advanced steelwork, navigation systems, communications hardware, and Arctic-grade engineering standards, all of which have spillover value in civilian and defense sectors. Once those capabilities are built out jointly, they do not stay confined to one project. They become part of a broader industrial base that can support courts, patrol vessels, surveillance platforms, and logistics infrastructure. That is why the ICE Pact is increasingly being read in Ottawa and Nordic capitals as more than a cooperation memo. It is a blueprint for resilience that happens to be built out of steel, software, and shipyard contracts. The irony is hard to miss. A pact meant to tighten allied coordination is also teaching those allies how to coordinate without the United States at the center. Industry officials and policy advisors have noticed the shift. At the March 2026 Oslo summit, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, and Canada moved trade and technology to the center of their security agenda, treating both as tools that can be used to pressure, exclude, or reshape markets. The shift accelerated a Nordic-Canadian realignment that has been building for months, with officials increasingly framing industrial policy as a defense issue rather than a narrow economic one. The summit's message was blunt: supply chains are no longer neutral, and access to critical inputs is now a strategic weapon. In private and public sessions, delegates focused on how tariffs, export controls, and procurement rules can be used to punish dependents and reward trusted partners. That logic has become the operating assumption in Ottawa and across the Nordic capitals. where policymakers are now talking less about efficiency and more about control. For Canada, the appeal is obvious. A country that spent years trying to balance U.S. integration with Arctic ambition is now finding that its best leverage may come from building alternative networks with states that share its security concerns and industrial priorities. Canadian officials see the Nordic bloc as a way to reduce exposure to American policy swings while expanding access to advanced manufacturing, digital systems, and cold weather expertise. The Nordic countries, for their part, are not treating this as charity or symbolism. They are reading the current trade environment as a warning that economic interdependence can be turned against smaller states when politics get ugly. That is why the conversation in Oslo centered on redundancy, trusted sourcing, and joint standards, with trade policy increasingly discussed in the same breath as defense readiness. Technology became the other half of the equation. Artificial intelligence, cyber tools, satellite systems, and industrial software were all discussed as dual-use assets that can strengthen civilian competitiveness while also hardening national resilience. Officials from several delegations argued that whoever controls the systems behind logistics, communications, and maritime operations controls far more than a market share chart. That argument has real consequences for procurement and investment. If the same platforms that move goods also move intelligence, then who builds them, who audits them, and who gets to plug into them becomes a sovereignty question. In that sense, the Oslo summit was less about abstract alignment and more about deciding which partners can be trusted when pressure rises and margins for error disappear. Industry leaders have been quick to notice the change in tone. Executives and advisors in the room described a growing willingness to use trade rules as leverage, not just as administrative plumbing. One policy advisor familiar with the discussion said the emerging view was that dependence is a vulnerability unless it is managed, diversified, and politically owned. That is pushing Canada and its Nordic partners toward a more explicit realignment. The old assumption that the United States sits at the center of every serious Western economic arrangement is losing force, replaced by a more transactional model built around shared capacity and reciprocal access. In practical terms, that means more joint planning, more cross-border industrial coordination, and fewer illusions about automatic alignment. Ottawa's hockey-friendly diplomacy is now being read in some policy circles as something far less casual, a coded signal that Canada, Finland, and their Nordic partners are building a durable economic security bloc designed to operate with less reliance on the United States. The shift is visible in how officials and business leaders are talking about infrastructure, minerals, shipping, and defense as one integrated system rather than separate policy lanes. At the center of that effort is a simple but consequential idea. Keep the full chain of extraction, processing, transport, and advanced manufacturing inside a trusted northern network. That means ports, ice-capable vessels, power generation, refining capacity, and industrial standards are being treated as strategic assets, not just commercial ones. In practice, the bloc is moving to reduce the leverage that comes from routing critical materials and logistics through outside powers. The Ottawa backdrop matters because it reflects a broader political adjustment that has been building for months. Canadian officials have increasingly framed Arctic and near-Arctic cooperation as resilience planning, while Finnish and Nordic counterparts have pushed the same message through industrial policy and defense coordination. The language is measured, but the architecture is not. It looks like a parallel system designed to keep key decisions inside a smaller, more predictable circle. Business executives involved in the discussion say the new model is built around closed-loop processing and shared standards that can support both commercial output and strategic autonomy. One industry source described the approach as making sure the family keeps the whole product, a blunt summary of the goal to retain value, data, and bargaining power within the bloc. That logic is drawing support because it reduces exposure to tariff shocks, export restrictions, and political pressure from larger markets. The Ottawa hockey scene, then, is not being dismissed as a photo op so much as reinterpreted as a diplomatic shorthand for a deeper realignment. Canada brings scale and resources. Finland brings industrial and logistics expertise. and the broader Nordic network brings geographic reach and policy alignment. Together, they are assembling a framework that could outlast election cycles and survive a more volatile U.S. posture. For Washington, the irony is hard to miss. Policies meant to increase leverage over allies may have accelerated the very coordination those allies were trying to avoid. As one European participant put it privately, the point was never to pick a fight. It was to make sure no one outside the network could dictate the terms. On that reading, the United States may have triggered the alliance it feared most.